doing a quick video here on the Ortho Bros, which is kind of like an online um, apologetical group that is, I guess, evangelizing for the Orthodox Church, you might say. And Dyer is one of the leaders of that, and he uses precept effectively. He understands it and uses it against Islam and whatnot, atheists, different groups. But the Orthodox Church rejects sola scriptura, as do the Mormons and the Catholics. For example, the Orthodox Church says in order to be saved, you have to be in right communion with the true apostolic church, which of course is them. And there are branches of Orthodox churches that are have disfellowshipped each other, and they've disfellowshipped Rome, and so there's schisms that go back, and so you have to ask yourself, okay, well, which church do I have to be in communion with? And so you therefore have to employ your sense data in order to research history and the Bible, and then try to conclude which is the correct church. But in the process of doing that, you are utilizing or using sola scriptura. You're using that standard as your final authority, because presuppositionally, which is what we're focused on here mainly, is if you say, well, we go and we investigate history and then we try to determine what the correct church is. Well, in order for you to evaluate history, you have to have an epistemology, and if your epistemology is valid, it has to be founded on the scriptures, and so what the Orthodox or the Ortho Bros, you'll hear them doing sometimes, is when you try to appeal to sola scriptura, they'll say, well, the scripture didn't exist apart from the church, so the church gave you the scriptures. And like we've talked about before, even if you don't know where the Bible came from, it's self-authenticating. So you can pick up any of the Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Protestant canons, and they have the doctrines necessary for presuppositionalism in them, and we talked about that before. But so if you approach it from a presuppositional standpoint, you have to have an epistemology which you derive from the scriptures in order to do history, in order for history to be even possible, because you have to validate your sense perception, you have to validate uniformities in nature through history, you have to validate the laws of logic and math all through history and our capacity to use them. And this has to be established first in order for you to have history. So you have to start with the scripture in order to have history, in order to go and evaluate which is the correct church. So you have to start with the scriptures in order to even come to the conclusion that the church is the correct church. But in addition to that, if you appeal to scripture to say, well, we need to figure out what the church is based on what the scriptures teach. Do they have the apostles' doctrines? Well, you have to go in and evaluate what they teach and compare it with scripture to determine whether or not they have the apostolic doctrines. And again, you're using the Bible as final authority, which is what sola scriptura says. So either way, you have to appeal to scripture as your foundation. And then if your conclusion is that sola scriptura is invalid, then you've refuted yourself. You've started with the scripture as your final authority to determine what the correct church is, but then your church tells you that sola scriptura is an invalid form of argument. So it's self-refuting. So they have a contradiction at their foundation of their argument. So there are other issues that you can get into when it comes to the canon and church history and whatnot, which is beyond our scope right now. But just see that as a foundational error in these guys' reasoning. On the one hand, you have to use history and scripture to determine what the church is, in which case you have elevated the scriptures to the position of final authority, because it's judging what the true church is, and it's given you the criteria in order to have an epistemology to do history, to validate history. So either way, the Scripture is your final authority, your final appeal. So anyway, just think about that. Let me know what you think in the comments.